Hi, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple seconds here. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me okay. So please type into the question box, no, if you can't hear me. So thank you all for joining us today for the Vermont Family Network Lunchtime Webinar Series. We have Eric Johnson with us from Voc Rehab. He is a transition counselor there, and I'll let him introduce himself. And before I do that, I'll just go over a couple logistical things to know about listening to webinars, as you will all be doing. So you'll probably notice that you are muted, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to ask questions, because we do. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, feel free to just type it in, and Eric and I will both be checking out the question box, and when your questions come up, he'll try and get to them. At the end of the webinar today, there'll be a short survey that will pop up on your screen, and there's about 5 questions, I think, and if you could just take a couple minutes to fill that out, it's really helpful for us for future webinars to let us know how we're doing and what we can improve on. And throughout the webinar, if you miss anything and want to go back and review it, we will have this recording posted on our website, and so you can go back and look through that if you need to refer back to this. And it'll be on our home screen. We have a webinar tab, and you can just click there, and we have all our previous webinars and webinars that are coming up. And we have many webinars planned for the future, so we hope that you'll want to join us for those in addition to the one today. In January, our topic will be on guardianship, and the dates for all of these are still being worked out, but these are just kind of things to look out for in the future, and keep checking back on our website. So in February, we have 2 webinars planned. One will be on coordinated services and planning, or Act 264. And we'll also be having a webinar on understanding the new children's health and support services, or it's referred to as CHAS. And then in March, we have a webinar on friendship and belonging. And then April, we're looking at something on assistive technology. So again, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them in, and here's Eric.
Good morning, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Eric Johnson. I am a transition counselor with Voc Rehab Vermont, and I work out of the Burlington office. And a couple things about myself first. I've been working with Voc Rehab now for about 6 years as a transition counselor. And prior to that, I worked for an organization called Weber, which I will talk more about in a few minutes, but also have a background working in schools and school-to-work programs, helping students find work, connect with employers, setting up work experiences, that sort of thing. So I would like to thank you all for tuning in. I think I've hopefully got a lot of good information for you. I'm sure that will generate a number of questions. I think that a lot of basic questions will be answered as I go along. But certainly, as Amy said, you're free to type those in, and we can address them as we feel we can in the flow of things. And I certainly want to thank Vermont Family Network for having me today, and been looking forward to this for a while, so away we go. There really are 3 things that I would like you all to take away from today's presentation. First of all, there are a lot of services available to students after graduating high school, and so I want you to understand the distinction between Voc Rehab and some of the other services that are available. Obviously, I want you to understand the eligibility guidelines for Voc Rehab program, and also understand the process of of being involved with Voc Rehab, what that looks like, and what we're looking for in terms of outcomes, etc. So, first of all, Voc Rehab Vermont is a state agency. We fall under the umbrella of the Agency of Human Services, and we are also under the umbrella further down the organizational chart for the Department of Aging and Independent Living. There are vocational rehabilitation offices throughout the state of Vermont, and there are transition counselors in each vocational rehabilitation office. A little bit of information about the work we do as transition counselors. Essentially, what we've tried to do by putting transition counselors in all Voc Rehab offices is to ensure that most all public high schools and even alternative schools have somebody at Voc Rehab that is a liaison with that school. And so many referrals come through the school system. Transition counselors are educated at a master's level. Most of us are either mental health counselors or masters of social work. And so there's a lot of work, obviously, and education that goes into that process. But we think that helps us understand our clients and set a level of sets the bar high in terms of the level of service that we can offer, and most importantly, the level of understanding we have for our clients. When your student comes out of high school, there are really three basic choices, and again, I'm simplifying things a lot here because it can get very complex. There are a lot of players in the picture, so I'm going to try to talk in general terms for the most part today, realizing that it looks a little different in every community, but generally speaking, there are three types of services available to students coming out of high school. There is, of course, Voc Rehab Vermont, and there are what we call developmental disability services, and I'm going to say more about each of these things in terms of eligibility and services provided in a few minutes. And then there are services that we term for at-risk youth type things, type services, and they are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes students are involved with all three entities at the same time, but Voc Rehab does partner with both developmental disability services and most of the at-risk services, and so your student should be referred to Voc Rehab and as well as some of these other agencies, and then sometimes we can help facilitate that process if it hasn't happened. And in fact, I can think of a number of situations where I have started working with a client who was unknown to me, and after graduation it turned out that really they should be referred to developmental services to get most of what they need. And so we do a fair amount of that as well. In terms of eligibility, Voc Rehab Vermont, I think, has the broadest scope in terms of eligibility for our services. There's simply 1, 2, 3. The student must have a documented disability, which means that a healthcare professional or a mental health professional has diagnosed your student with something. There is some diagnosis involved, and we need to have documentation of that diagnosis, and that's for a lot of reasons. First of all, we are bound to serve people with disabilities, and so we have to be sure that they actually do have a disability. But also, more importantly, in my view anyway, is that we really need to understand who your student is. And so that documentation, as all of you who have students who receive special education services know, there are a lot of assessments and tools used throughout their high school career to determine, ability and challenges and those kinds of things. The second criteria, I back up a minute. In terms of service priority, we are designated to serve people with the highest level of need, and that's something that we kind of determine as we get to know a student, and sometimes that's not always apparent. Sometimes students who seem to do very well have a level of need that that we discover as we get to know the student, and sometimes the converse is true. But in any case, whatever the challenges are, they must prove to be a functional barrier to employment for our eligibility criteria. And usually that's not a problem to figure out whether that is a functional barrier to employment. And I can't think of a single situation that for a student that I've worked with where that a student hasn't met that eligibility requirement. And then of course they must benefit from our services. And again, the scope of our services is so broad that I'm sure that almost any student involved could benefit from our services. So really, to simplify things a little bit, if your student is on an IEP in high school, chances are they are eligible for our services. 504 plans are a little bit different matter, and so we do look at those carefully, and those students may or may not be deemed eligible. So we look at all of that very carefully. Services through Voc Rehab Vermont are free. They are voluntary, and they are confidential. We are bound by HIPAA guidelines, and that comes into play a fair amount in our work because we deal with the issue of disclosure. And when I say disclosure, I'm talking about talking to employers about a student's challenges and supports. Generally speaking, if an employer doesn't know about a disability, then they are not required to provide any kind of accommodation. And so that is a discussion that we have as we go along. Disclosure is not always necessary. In fact, some clients prefer that we do not disclose, and that's absolutely fine. The next point is that we are client-centered and client-driven, and so although our role is to provide counseling and guidance, we have to respect our client wishes, and that's as it should be. I'm going to contrast our eligibility requirements with those of developmental services, just so, again, I get a lot of questions about this in general. And so the distinction is that eligibility for developmental services is based on primarily IQ, so all of the WISCs and the WACEs and the Woodcock-Johnson tests that your kids take while they're in school kind of determine eligibility for developmental services. So when we talk about eligibility for those services, we're talking about a full-scale IQ of 70 or less, and also, in addition to that, 2 areas of deficit, for lack of a better term, and adaptive functioning. Or a student can have autism and also 2 areas of adaptive functioning. And so many of you, especially with students who are perhaps approaching the end of their high school career, have been asked to do some adaptive functioning questionnaires and surveys, and that is usually a process that involves the student themselves, the parents and family members, school personnel, etc. So through that process, it's determined that, yes, the independent living skills are not what they should be, or safety is a real issue here. And so those are examples of some of the areas we're looking at, that developmental services are looking at. Also, the funding mechanism for developmental services is a little different. Our services are funded through both state and federal dollars, whereas many of the services received through developmental disabilities come through what's called the Medicaid waiver. Developmental services usually is a wrap of services. In other words, they deal with the 4 areas of transition: work, vocational training or post-secondary education, independent living, and access to the community. And in a few minutes I'll talk a little bit more about the distinction there as well between developmental services and voc rehab. Many people in developmental services receive Social Security benefits such as SSI, SSDI. Developmental services are also designed to be long-term services and very often are a lifetime of services. And one of the major distinctions with developmental services is they can provide supported employment such as job coach and that sort of thing, and that's not something for the most part that voc rehab is equipped to do. And I will again say more about that in a few minutes. Youth at risk typically come to us through organizations such as NFI or Department of Children and Families, very often corrections, unfortunately. And in the Chittenden County area, Spectrum Youth and Family Services kind of are one of the great resources we have in Chittenden County for what we consider at-risk youth. And these are kids that often have been, again, involved with foster care, are in danger of being homeless, are in danger of dropping out of high school, may have substance abuse or mental health issues. So those would be the kinds of students that kind of come under this broad category. We have something called a JOBS program, which is an acronym for Jump on Board for Success, and that is also a statewide program that works with at-risk youth as well. And that is also more of a wrap of services in that in most JOBS programs there is certainly an employment focus, helping kids find employment and prepare for employment with a job readiness program. But very often, in the case of Spectrum especially, they also have access to mental health counseling and physical health services. So when special educators are writing transition plans, this is a simplified kind of look at what they're looking at. Work, play, living and learning. Developmental services and at-risk services often dwell in all of these areas, work in all of these areas, whereas the focus of vocational rehabilitation is specifically work, but also the learning part of the matrix. Support for college and vocational training is a big part of what we do. And so our process involves setting a vocational goal and then figuring out what services are needed to reach that goal. So we're very much in the realm of employment. That is our primary focus, although our services can entail a number of things in all of the areas of transition. A little bit about the process. How do students get referred? How do students get involved in the process of voc rehab? Most referrals come through the high school, come through the student's high school. They can be introduced to voc rehab as early as age 16. And that, in fact, is the age when special educators are required to start writing transition plans for your students. But at that point, because voc rehab is an adult service agency, at that point, our involvement is somewhat limited. In fact, what we usually do is what we call a follow-along until the year of graduation. And the follow-along entails things such as going to IEP meetings, going to transition meetings, meeting with the student, and if they're in a vocational program in school, meeting with the people involved in supporting the student in the vocational program, and in some cases also going to observe the student in their work experience settings. And so we the purpose of all of this is to get to know the student, understand what their strengths are, and go from there in terms of an employment goal, developing an employment goal. I see there's a question that's come in regarding what we do at IEP meetings, and essentially what we do is listen, because our goal is to learn about students, learn about pretty much every aspect of their lives, looking for specifically their strengths, areas that we can build upon, but also looking at challenges and starting to formulate ideas about how they might need to be supported once they graduate. So really the process of us sitting in on IEP meetings is to listen primarily, but also we can sometimes offer resources to the team. There may be something out there that the school team is not aware of, and perhaps we can bring that to the table and help in the development of the vocational plan. And that is really what we're driving toward, is to, by the time a student graduates, we want to have the makings of a vocational plan in place for them. And that may involve carrying forward something that's already been happening in high school. And ideally that would be the case, so we can build on something that has been being constructed over a course of years, but sometimes we're also starting from scratch. In terms of homeschool students, we've got another question about that, and thanks for asking that question. That's a great question. You can refer yourself or refer a student directly to Voc Rehab by contacting the local Voc Rehab office and asking for the transition counselor. And the timeline would be exactly the same as it would be for a student in public schools. So you're very welcome to refer students, and are encouraged to do so. I'd like to talk a little bit about the process of the vocational plan, because that really is the thing that drives Voc Rehab services for students. And you know, in almost any vocational plan, we're looking at short-term and long-term goals. So, for example, a student who may be going to college to be a veterinary tech, that may be their long-term goal, but their short-term goal may just be, I just need help finding a job to sort of support myself while I'm in college, or make money while I'm in college. Or, in a lot of cases, what we try to do is develop work experiences related to the long-term goal. So, for example, I'm working with a student now who is, in fact, in college for a vet tech program. And one of the things we did this past summer was set up an internship with her at a veterinary office. And so when this student graduates from the class, she will actually have had experience working in a veterinary office, but also a connection to a veterinarian who can provide maybe a job, but certainly at least a reference for this student. So when they graduate, they've got a little bit more material available to them, a few more tools in their toolbox in terms of being able to find a job. But essentially, when we develop a plan, what we do is figure out what is the goal and what support do you need to reach that goal, and that kind of drives the services that we offer. Our vocational plans are very fluid, and we can change them as we need to change them, and so students aren't locked into, you know, a veterinary tech if that just isn't working out, or if a student changes their mind, which happens a lot along the way. Very few people really know what they want to do when they graduate high school. Um, Going into the development of a vocational plan, I've already kind of talked a little bit about this, but we do some assessments, and some of those assessments are formal assessments. But what we're really looking at from our perspective, from a vocational perspective, is are the job ready, the level of job readiness. And so we look at both hard skills and soft skills. What can a student actually do in terms of specific work skills that may be transferable to another situation? If a student has done, for example, some prep work, that's something that's very, very specific. They can use a knife. They understand kitchen safety, those kinds of things. And then, of course, we assess the soft skills, which are so important in the workplace. You know, essentially, to sum up soft skills, we call that social intelligence, social thinking, which is a term I'm sure you've all heard a lot about. But these are some examples of some formal assessments. We look at, you know, reports and actual grades from the academic world. We look at psychoeducational evaluations. We look at psychological evaluations, OT evaluations, speech and language therapist evaluations, interest inventories, personality profiles. There are all kinds of actual formal assessments that we can use to, first of all, these kinds of things provide the documentation that we need for eligibility, but they also sort of paint a broad picture of the level of supports that have been developed for the student. I find, in my experience, that informal assessments in terms of vocation are extremely important. Observations from work experience that the students have had from their supervisors, school personnel, coworkers, parents, case managers, personal observation, that sort of thing. Excuse me. But also observations in other settings. How do they do in terms of social intelligence? And I find it extremely useful to sit down with a student and just talk to them about what their interests are and about their jobs, and so much can be said so much can be learned from just listening to a student and their parents and from other people involved in the student's life. A question came in around the assessments regarding, do we actually provide these assessments? And generally speaking, the answer is no. Most of these assessments should be done while a student is in school. However, that's not to say that we haven't done assessments when we feel like maybe there's some information missing, or maybe there needs to be an update. Students tend to develop and grow while they're in school, and something that was maybe applicable 3 years ago isn't applicable now. And generally speaking, any assessment that a school does should be no more than 3 years old when we're looking at that. So most of what we're doing is kind of reviewing the records that exist. However, we do have the resources if we feel like it's necessary to actually contract for assessments ourselves. In terms of actual services written into an employment plan, these are some examples of things. One of the things I should really emphasize, I think, is that although anybody can be enrolled in Voc Rehab services, we do rely on a fairly high level of engagement and involvement on the part of our clients. And it may be that a student who's involved in developmental services has more support, or involved in the at-risk services has more support than we can offer. But essentially, every Voc Rehab office has one transition counselor for, 100 or more students on their caseload. And so we really do count on a lot of collaboration and a lot of engagement on the part of the student. And so things that we do a lot of are career and job exploration, and also just sort of career guidance and counseling. That's really one of the primary things we do, just sort of sitting down again with the student and the family and talking about things and figuring out what makes sense and doing some problem solving. We can help with job assistance. A lot of students aren't really sure how to go about it in an effective way. For example, developing personal networks and utilizing those. Support for vocational training in college, that's something that obviously we do a lot of. And they're two very different things in terms of our policies and how we can support them. So, for example, vocational training, we look at that. We look at that in terms of the goal the student sets and how realistic the program is, how accessible it is, how realistic the chances for success are. That really is what we're looking at. And in terms of college, the type of work we do involves helping a student make an informed decision about the school that they're going to be attending. Because when you go to college, it's really on the student to figure out what my supports are and then going after them and actually asking for supports. And so we help advise in that process, and it's often a process that students are not comfortable with and not familiar with. And it's really important when you're considering college to look at the level of support, because colleges vary a lot in their ability to support students. And so you want to, that's, if I could emphasize anything about going to college, that would be it, to be sure that you know what supports your student's going to get, or your student knows what supports they need and are going to get. We can help with assistive technology. Generally, our support for a student in college is around things like training, books and supplies and things that they need, but sometimes assistive technology comes into play, and we can help with that. If a student is going into a vocational training program or certainly a job, we can help with providing the tools and equipment and specialized clothing they may need for a job. One of the areas that we do a lot of is referral to other services. Referral to services outside of the scope of what we do, which is, again, vocational training and job readiness. So we may refer a student to mental health services or legal help services or physical health services. One of our really important partners that we have at our disposal is an organization called VABER, and that stands for the Vermont Association of Business, Industry, and Rehabilitation. And what VABER does is a level of supported employment. It's not as intensive or long-term as you would find in a developmental disability service organization, but what we do is we refer people to VABER who need more intensive support in finding a job. And the folks at VABER are part of what we call Creative Workforce Solutions, which really is a fairly new initiative. It's essentially a collaborative of job developers from various agencies who are sharing resources, sharing leads, and probably most importantly, developing relationships with employers. So that one of the tools we use a lot these days is what we call progressive employment, which includes things such as starting out with a job, informational interviews, job shadows, even work experiences that are subsidized by Voc Rehab. And in terms of referral to VABER, we've got a question here about how do we refer to VABER. The referrals to VABER come through Voc Rehab. So you're first a Voc Rehab client, and then the referral is made to VABER. One of the things, again, about VABER, although they've grown recently, their capacity, unfortunately, isn't what we would love it to be, in an ideal world. So that's why our job as Voc Rehab counselors is to get people to a point that we consider job ready, and then we make the referral to VABER for the active job search process. There's also a question that's come through about actual job training. No, and the answer is no. We do not perform actual job training. What we do is sponsor programs designed to do job training, or we can support an existing vocational program. Support meaning we can help pay for it and provide the tools, equipment, materials that might be needed for that. One of the really important points about Voc Rehab services is that while developmental services are designed to be kind of long-term, Voc Rehab supports are really not designed to be long-term. And so however long it takes to work with someone and develop a plan for employment is however long it takes. But once a person has found the job that they're looking for, and it's a stable job and things are going well, we consider that a successful outcome. And so we actually close the case. And the reason the system is set up that way is because that's how Voc Rehab, or one of the funding mechanisms that Voc Rehab receives funding through. So we are measured on the number of successful employment outcomes that we have per year, and our funding kind of reflects that. And so this is a standard that is actually set up by the organization that oversees us. And the good news is that when a client decides that they have a different employment goal, or whatever the case may be, whether their case is closed or not, they can re-access services at any point. And you don't need necessarily to go through the whole rigmarole of providing new documents and all of that stuff. The eligibility has been established, and so really what we do is just develop a new plan and start working on that. There are some definite things that we've found in terms of success, in terms of finding meaningful employment. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that students are actively engaged in the process. This should not be, regardless of whatever level we're talking about, should be as much as possible a process that students are engaged in and not a passive kind of thing. So mainly because statistics show that students who are engaged are generally more successful at sort of finding something that's meaningful to them. But so the exploration process, certainly we want to be working with students that have an understanding of, or are developing an understanding of, what their interests are. And they're also learning a level of independence and self-advocacy that will be important to them throughout the job process. One of the things that you will find as parents is that once your student is an adult, your role changes in terms of the job market and the job search. Employers are not interested in speaking with parents about finding their kids jobs, that sort of thing. And so fostering a level of independence and self-advocacy is extremely important. And then, of course, developing the actual skills for being ready to work. Early work experiences is a big thing statistically. Again, statistics show that early work experiences in the home, and that, that's your basic doing chores, having responsibilities, that sort of thing, are important. School-based early work experiences are extremely important, and very often is the first introduction that students have to the world of work outside of the home, really. And then, of course, from school-based experiences come community-based experiences. So, for example, you may have a student that maybe works in the library at school, and the next step would be to get them a work experience in the town library, something progressive like that. A supportive, engaged family is extremely important. As a transition counselor, we work with parents all the time, and we work with teams, and that needs to be a pretty transparent process. We all need to communicate clearly and understand what the goals are, but ways that parents can be supportive is, again, fostering those early work experiences at home, and giving the kids chores to do. Sometimes, the concept of positive reinforcement, getting, privileges or something desired, not always money, because kids don't always value money, especially the younger ones. But something, just the concept of developing the concept of positive reinforcement. And, these kinds of things build skills, actual hard skills, and that they also build a sense of self-confidence and autonomy. And I think anything a family can do to promote self-awareness and giving their kid a voice is extremely important. I've worked with a number of students who, when you ask them questions about things, they kind of look at mom or dad, or they look at somebody else in the room to answer the question. And we want to get to a point where a kid understands themselves and are confident in expressing their ideas and their likes and dislikes and those kinds of things. I've got on the screen a list of website resources, and I'd like to say a little bit about each of these. The first one, Dale, Vermont, the Department of Aging and Independent Living website, is how you would access the Voc Rehab website. And you can go on there. If you go on the Dale website, you can actually see all of the other agencies under the umbrella of Dale. And I think that may be a good exercise to do, simply because you get an understanding of what other services are out there in addition to Voc Rehab that may address some of those other areas in your student's life that we don't address in Voc Rehab. The next website is VSAC, and VSAC is traditionally been known as the people you go to if you need money for college, but they are a tremendous resource for various types of exploration, both job and college exploration activities you can find on their website. And also they have something called a non-degree grant, which is free money available to students for vocational training. And again, you can access that through their website. The next two are the transitioncoalition.org and TRIPSKI are both great resources for all things transition. You go on the website, especially the Transition Coalition, and all kinds of information about all aspects of transition. And I think an extremely valuable resource that I would encourage you all to attend or to tune into, log on to, I guess. I put Howard Center on the list. That is our what's called designated agency in Chittenden County. And designated agencies are kind of the gatekeepers for determining eligibility for developmental disability services. And so you should definitely know who your designated agency is and bring them into the picture earlier than later. I unfortunately have seen some situations where the designated agency is brought in kind of late in the process, and that delays services to the student. So when I say early, I don't think it hurts to have your designated agency aware of your student, by their junior year, if not sooner than that. And then the next website is the Vermont Department of Education website, and on that website you can find a link to transition planning information. And again, there's a wealth of information on there on what's required in a transition plan, what you should be looking at in terms of transition planning. And again, I would encourage you to look at that website and arm yourself with as much information as you can about that process. And finally, I put on a website that actually is a website from one of the schools that I work with, the Essex High School Employment Program website, and they actually have some great resource links on the website, things such as work skills competencies and those kinds of things that you can look at and understand, kind of what an employer is looking at in terms of certain things, and what schools are looking at, and also some of the criteria we're looking at in terms of determining job readiness for a student. And so there are many, many more. Certainly Vermont Family Network website, which I don't have on here, is a wealth of information for you folks as well. That's what I have for you folks today. I know I breezed through a lot of stuff and hopefully was able to answer some questions, but I think we have a little time now. If there are other questions, feel free to type them in, and I'll do the best I can. Okay. Well, it looks like we're set, and please feel free again to contact your individual Voc Rehab office if you do have questions. If you have a student in high school, ask for the transition counselor in that office, and we'll be happy to give you the information you need and do what we can to help your student. Get a copy of the. And I'm going to there's a couple of questions about getting copies of this. I'm going to turn that over to Amy because she knows more about the technical aspects. But thank you all for logging in, and again, I would encourage you to contact our offices if you have any questions about any of this stuff.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Eric. And it looks like I have a question about copying. We do mail out copies of the webinar. If you would like one, you can send me an email, and my email is amy, A-M-Y, huckins@vtfn.org. And if you missed that, if you go to our website and click on the webinars tab, my email is pretty much all over that page. So just so that I can keep track of it, that would be great. And are you able to get a copy of the PowerPoint? We don't normally send out copies of the PowerPoint, and that would, I guess, be a question for Eric if he
I'd be happy to. Probably the easiest thing would be to email it to someone. So if they, I guess, if they wanted to email me directly and ask for it?
So we'll put Eric's email up. It'll probably be right underneath the recording of this webinar on our website. So if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, you can just send him an email and ask him that way. And if there's any other questions about, copying or the recording on the website, please feel free to ask, and we should have that up soon. So thank you again, and don't forget that when you exit out of here, a little survey will pop up. So if you could just fill that out real quick, we would greatly appreciate it. So thank you again, and join us next month.